The air in the grand ballroom of the Caesar's palace crackled with the electric hum of anticipation and the faint, lingering scent of stale cigar smoke and expensive perfume. It was 1975, the zenith of the full, contact karate explosion, and the man at the center of the universe was Bill Wallace. He stood under the hot glare of the television lights, a triumphant grin plastered across his handsome face, the PKA World Middleweight Championship belt slung casually over his shoulder. He'd just dismantled his opponent with a casual, almost contemptuous grace, the fight ending as it so often did, with the blinding blur of his left leg arsing through the air and connecting with a sound like a wet towel snapping against concrete. "They call you Superfoot for a reason," Bill, the announcer, a man with a booming voice and a garish polyester suit, said, holding the microphone up. "That left leg seems to move at the speed of thought. Is there anyone out there, in any weight class, who you think could give you a real challenge?" The Wallace let out a low, confident chuckle that the microphone picked up and amplified throughout the hushed room. He ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed brown hair, playing to the cameras. "A challenge? I'm always looking for a challenge," he began, his voice smooth as Tennessee whiskey. "But you look around, a lot of these guys are still stuck in the past. They're rigid. They practice these ancient dance routines they call kaita, and think it's preparing them for a real fight." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. The announcer, sensing a headline, pressed on. "Are you referring to anyone in particular?" "The traditionalists. What about a name like Chuck Norris? He's a legend, a 6-time world champion, now a big movie star. His style, Chun-Kuk-Do, is deeply rooted in that tradition." Wallace's grin widened into a predatory smirk. This was the opening he'd been waiting for. The name Chuck Norris carried a weight that his own, despite his undefeated record, had yet to achieve in the mainstream. Norris was a household name, the face of karate to millions who had never set foot in a dojo. To Wallace, he was a symbol of an era he was determined to render obsolete. "Chuck's a great guy," Wallace said, the words dripping with condescension. "A fantastic movie star, makes our sport look good. But let's be honest about the style. It's stiff. It's linear. You stand in that deep horse stance. You move back and forth in a straight line. A guy like me, with movement, with angles. It's a dinosaur trying to fight a hummingbird. I'd kick his head off his shoulders before he could even finish his first ki." A ripple of gasps and nervous laughter went through the crowd. It was a direct, targeted insult, a flagrant violation of the unspoken code of respect that governed the martial arts world. You didn't just mock another man's style, you mocked his life's work, his philosophy, his very soul. Thousands of miles away, in a humble dojo in Torrance, California, the object of that mockery was kneeling on the polished wooden floor. The air in the studio was thick with the smell of sweat and dedication. Chuck Norris was leading his advanced class, his voice calm and steady as he guided them through a kata. His movements were precise, economical, each block, each strike, each shift in stance executed with a contained power that seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. There was no wasted motion, no flourish for the camera. It was pure, unadulterated function. After the class, as his students were bowing out, his senior instructor, a weathered man named Howard Jackson, approached him, a copy of Black Belt magazine rolled up in his hand. "Did you see this, Chuck?" he asked, his voice tight with anger. Norris took the magazine. The cover story was, "Superfoot's challenge, is traditional karate obsolete?" Inside, Wallace's quotes were printed in bold, his arrogant face smiling out from the page. Norris read the words, his expression unreadable. He felt no anger, only a quiet, profound disappointment. He'd known Bill for years. He respected his athletic ability, his incredible speed and flexibility. But this was different. This was arrogance born of ignorance. "He doesn't understand," Norris said softly, handing the magazine back. "He sees the kata, but he doesn't see the application. He sees the stance, but he doesn't see the foundation. He sees a block, but he doesn't see the takedown hidden within it." "People are talking," Howard pressed. "They're saying you're scared of him, that your movie career has made you soft." And Norris looked at the faces of his students, who were lingering, pretending to pack their gear bags but listening intently. He saw the doubt in some of their eyes, the anger in others. Wallace's words weren't just an attack on him, they were an attack on them, on everything they spent hours bleeding and sweating to perfect. "Words are wind," Norris said, his voice carrying across the dojo. "Let him talk. The mat doesn't lie. Our focus is here, in our training, in perfecting ourselves. That is the true way of the warrior." But Bill Wallace was relentless. He saw Norris's silence not as dignified restraint, but as fear. He doubled down, his taunts growing more personal and more public. On a talk show, he demonstrated a slow, clumsy parody of a karate chop, laughing as the audience roared. He wrote an editorial claiming that sparring champions like Norris would be lost in the new era of full contact, where toughness, not just technique, was king. The campaign of disrespect reached its apex at the Long Beach Internationals, a tournament Norris had once dominated. Wallace wasn't competing, but he was there as a celebrity guest. He watched from the sidelines as one of Norris's top students, a talented young fighter named Marcus, competed in the finals. Marcus fought with the clean, powerful technique of Chun Kuk Do, but his opponent was unorthodox and aggressive. It was a close match, and in the final seconds, Marcus lost by a single point. As Marcus walked off the mat, dejected, Wallace intercepted him, a microphone from a ringside reporter suddenly in his face. "Tough break, kid," Wallace said, draping a familiar, condescending arm over the young man's shoulders. "You see, all that perfect form, all that dancing around in a real fight, it crumbles. Your teacher is selling you old goods, it's pretty, but it'll get you knocked out in the street." Marcus stood there, humiliated and speechless. Back in Torrance, word of the incident spread through the dojo like a virus. It was one thing to insult Chuck Norris, the legend. It was another thing entirely to publicly humiliate one of his students, to poison the well of their dedication. That evening, Norris sat in quiet meditation in the center of his dojo long after everyone had left. The words of his own master, the great Tang Soo Do founder Huang Qi, echoed in his mind. The purpose of training is to perfect oneself and to protect life, not to seek conflict. He had avoided this conflict. He had turned the other cheek. But Wallace wasn't just seeking conflict. He was attacking the very core of what Norris believed in. He was corrupting the spirit of martial arts for his own ego. The disrespect to his student was the final straw. It was no longer about him. It was about honor. The next day, Chuck Norris made a single phone call to a well-known promoter. The message was simple and direct. He accepted Bill Wallace's challenge, but not for a PKA-sanctioned kickboxing match with padded gloves and restrictive rules. This would be different. A special exhibition match, 5 rounds, bare knuckles, bare feet, held in a neutral location, a private gym in Las Vegas, away from the circus of television cameras. This would not be a sport, it would be a lesson. The news hit the martial arts community like a thunderclap. The fight was on. The two men's preparations were a study in contrasts. Bill Wallace's training camp was a spectacle. He trained in a flashy, modern gym in Los Angeles, always surrounded by an entourage of reporters, celebrities, and sycophants. His workouts were explosive displays of his prodigious athletic gifts. He'd spend hours on the heavy bag, his left leg a piston, throwing hundreds of hook kicks, side kicks, and roundhouses, each one a blur of motion. He'd hold court with journalists, explaining in intricate detail how he would exploit the gaping holes in Norris's traditional stance. "Look," he'd say, pointing to a photo of Norris in a deep fighting stance. "He's flat-footed, a statue. All his weight is committed. I'll feint low, he'll drop his hands, and my foot will be having a conversation with his chin. It'll be over in 2 rounds. 3 tops. I'm doing him a favor, really, exposing this outdated nonsense so the art can evolve." His confidence was absolute, a fortress with no windows. He truly believed he was the next evolution of combat, and Norris was the fossil he was about to put in a museum. Meanwhile, on a secluded ranch in the California hills, Chuck Norris's camp was a monastery of silent, brutal efficiency. There were no reporters, no hangers-on. It was just Norris, Howard Jackson, and a handful of his most trusted black belts. Their days started before dawn with long runs through the rugged terrain, building a deep, unshakable stamina. Their training wasn't about flash, it was about forging a weapon. Norris spent hours in front of the makiwara, the traditional striking post wrapped in rice straw. The rhythmic thud of his knuckles, shins, and the balls of his feet striking the post echoed through the quiet hills. It was a painful, repetitive conditioning that hardened his body's weapons to the density of stone. He wasn't just training for a fight, he was preparing for a war. But the bulk of their time was spent on strategy. They had old films of Wallace's fights, and they watched them for hours on a rattling projector. Howard would point out the subtle tells. "See that, Chuck? Before every big kick, he does a little stutter, step with his right foot. It's his tell. It's how he sets his base." Norris would nod, his eyes locked on the screen, his mind a computer processing data. He wasn't looking at the kicks themselves, but at the space around them, the mechanics that made them possible. Wallace saw his own style as fluid and unpredictable, but Norris saw the pattern, the rhythm hidden beneath the chaos. He saw the truth: Wallace wasn't a hummingbird. He was a master musician who only knew how to play one spectacular song. His power comes from that left leg, Norris observed one evening, pausing the film on a frame of Wallace at the apex of a kick. But to generate that power, his right leg has to be planted. It's his foundation. It's his root. And if you chop the root, the tree will fall. The strategy was set. It was a classic, traditional karate principle: destroy the foundation. It wasn't about meeting Wallace's flash with more flash. It was about using disciplined, devastatingly effective technique to systematically dismantle the man's only weapon. The night of the fight, the air in the private Las Vegas gym was thick enough to chew. There was no roaring crowd, only a few dozen select witnesses, elite martial artists, promoters, and trusted associates from both camps. The silence was more intense than the roar of any stadium. This was a pure, unfiltered crucible. Bill Wallace entered first, looking like a rock star. He wore satin shorts and a robe, and he bounced on the balls of his feet, his body loose and radiating a nervous energy that he masked with a cocky smile. He shadowboxed, his legs snapping out in blindingly fast arcs, a clear display of the weapon he was about to unleash. Then, the door on the other side of the gym opened. Chuck Norris emerged. He wore simple white karate pants, his chest bare. He didn't bounce, he didn't shadowbox. He walked to the mat with a deliberate, grounded pace, each step planted with purpose. His eyes, clear and calm, were fixed on Wallace. The message was clear: one man had come to perform, the other had come to fight. When they met in the center of the mat, Wallace couldn't resist one last dig. "Ready for your lesson, old man?" he whispered, his smirk firmly in place. Norris didn't answer. He simply stared into Wallace's eyes, and for the first time, Wallace felt a flicker of something other than supreme confidence. He saw an unnerving stillness, a depth he couldn't fathom. It was like looking into a deep, cold well. The bell rang. The first round was exactly what Wallace had predicted. He was a whirlwind of motion. He used a bladed sideways stance, presenting a minimal target, constantly bouncing, feinting, and circling. His left leg was a relentless metronome of violence. Quick side kicks to the knee, snapping roundhouses to the body, probing jabs with his foot that kept Norris constantly off balance. Norris was on the defensive, his hands held high in a traditional guard. He moved little, absorbing the lighter kicks on his arms and legs, weathering the storm. To the untrained eye, it looked like a massacre. Wallace was scoring at will, dancing around a stationary target. Wallace's corner was ecstatic. He was making a legend look like a novice. He shot a wink at his corner, his arrogance swelling with every unanswered kick. The bell ended the round, and Wallace danced back to his stool, breathing easily. "He's slow. He can't touch me," he crowed to his trainer. In the other corner, Norris sat on his stool, his breathing calm and even. Howard leaned in. "You have it now." Norris took a sip of water and nodded. "I have it." He had spent the entire round not trying to fight, but to learn. He had downloaded the data. He had timed the stutter step. He had felt the rhythm of Wallace's attack. He knew the song by heart. Now, it was time to break the instrument. The bell for the second round rang. Wallace came out with even more swagger, expecting the same defensive shell. He launched a quick side kick, the opening move of his familiar combination. But this time, something was different. As his foot shot out, Norris wasn't there. He had taken a subtle 45-degree step, a fundamental movement from his kata, moving offline just enough that the kick whistled past empty air. Before Wallace could retract his leg, Norris exploded forward. It wasn't a kick. It was a reverse punch, a devastatingly simple technique drilled into every white belt. But delivered with Norris's precision and conditioned power, it was like being hit by a piston. His fist drove deep into Wallace's floating ribs. The air shot out of Wallace's lungs in a pained grunt. The punch wasn't just painful, it was a shock to his entire system. He had never been hit that cleanly, that hard. His bouncing stopped. For a split second, he was flat-footed, stationary. And in that second, Norris delivered the first part of his strategy. It was a low, scything kick, aimed not at the head or body, but at the outside of Wallace's right calf, the standing leg. The impact was brutal, a deadening thud that sent a jolt of lightning up Wallace's leg. His knee buckled. He stumbled, catching his balance, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and disbelief. The fight had changed. The hummingbird was grounded. Wallace, now angry and desperate to reassert his dominance, abandoned his careful, bouncy game. He started forcing his attacks, trying to overwhelm Norris with sheer speed. He threw a high, powerful roundhouse kick, the kind that had ended so many of his fights. He put everything into it, a desperate gamble to end it right there. But Norris had been waiting for it. He had seen the tell. The slight dip of the shoulder, the stutter, step. As the kick began its ascent, Norris didn't retreat. He moved forward, stepping inside the arc of the kick. With one hand, he deflected the leg just enough to guide it past his head. With his other hand, he grabbed Wallace's supporting shoulder. In one fluid, devastating motion rooted in the grappling applications of his ancient forms, Norris swept Wallace's standing leg. The effect was catastrophic. Bill Wallace, the master of balance and movement, was sent cartwheeling through the air. He crashed to the mat with a sickening thud, his body twisting at an unnatural angle. A sharp, audible snap echoed through the silent gym. His right ankle, the pillar of his entire fighting style, had been caught and twisted beneath him as he fell. Wallace lay on the mat, his face a mask of agony and shock. The physical pain was immense, a white, hot fire consuming his leg, but the psychological pain was infinitely worse. His arrogance, his confidence, his entire worldview had been shattered in a single, perfectly executed, traditional technique. He had mocked the foundation of Norris's style, and in return, Norris had destroyed his. Norris stood over him, not with a look of triumph, but of somber finality. He had not wanted this. He had been forced to teach a lesson, and the lesson was now complete. The referee, seeing Wallace writhing on the ground, waved the fight off. It was over. The aftermath was a scene of quiet, humbling defeat. Norris walked over to Wallace as the medics tended to his broken ankle. He knelt down, and the arrogant, mocking eyes of Bill Wallace now looked up at him with a raw, desperate vulnerability. "How?" Wallace managed to whisper through gritted teeth. "You have a great weapon," Norris said, his voice soft but firm. "But you only have one. A true martial artist learns to be a weapon himself. Every part of him. My stance wasn't a weakness, it was a connection to the earth. My kata wasn't a dance, it was a library of answers. You just never learned how to read." Norris then did something that stunned everyone in the room. He reached down and gently placed a hand on Wallace's shoulder, a simple gesture of respect for a fallen warrior. Weeks turned into months. Bill Wallace's broken ankle healed, but the break in his spirit took longer to mend. The plaster cast came off, but the weight of his humility remained. He replayed the fight 1,000 times in his mind, not with anger, but with a new analytical clarity. He finally saw it. The subtle step, the perfectly timed punch, the devastatingly simple sweep. He saw the genius in the simplicity he had once mocked. One crisp autumn afternoon, the door to Chuck Norris's dojo in Torrance opened. A man stood there, leaning heavily on a cane. It was Bill Wallace. He was no longer the flamboyant champion. He wore simple workout clothes, and his face was stripped of all its former bravado. He looked older, and for the first time wise. He walked onto the edge of the mat where Norris was instructing a class of children. He didn't speak. He simply waited. When the class was over, Norris approached him. Wallace looked at the man who had so thoroughly dismantled him. He took a deep, shaky breath, and then he did something he had never done before. He bowed. A deep, formal, respectful bow, not to the movie star or the champion, but to the master. "I was wrong," Wallace said, his voice quiet and clear. "I was arrogant, and I was ignorant. I thought I knew what fighting was. You showed me I knew nothing at all." He paused, looking down at the mat. "I came here to ask if you would teach me. I want to learn how to read." Chuck Norris looked at the broken man before him, no longer an arrogant rival but a sincere student of the arts. He saw the death of a false ego and the birth of a true martial artist. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "The first lesson," Norris said, gesturing for Wallace to step onto the mat. "Humility. It seems you have already begun."